All right, here we go. This is NSCA Chapter 8. This is still focused on exercise psychology, goal setting, and motivation. For this presentation, which is presentation number 3, we'll be talking about motivation. And I will tell you that this will probably be one of the more challenging, if not the most challenging, of these three to kind of wrap yourself around. Within motivation itself, we have positive and negative reinforcement as well as positive and negative punishment. We'll talk about self-determination theory, effective rewards on intrinsic motivation, and when to intervene with motivational efforts. And where we'll really focus on this will be up in these three. So let's go ahead and jump on in. So a motivation, when you look at it, they describe it as this: a psychological construct that arouses and directs behavior. A construct is an internal drive or neural process that cannot be directly observed but must be indirectly inferred from observation or outward behavior. So you're basically trying to impart, if you will, motivation into a client or an athlete, and you're trying to evaluate the response that you get from the person. Now, this is in the very complex nature of the interactions we have with other people, where you have some individuals are task oriented, some people are outcome oriented, some people have higher anxiety, some people have maybe more state anxiety, some might respond more with trait anxiety, right? Some people might have a high SNS, some people might have a very low regulated or low down regulated sympathetic nervous system for that fight or flight response. It's very complex. I'm not going to try to I'm going to try to simplify this, but realize it's a very complex process. When you look at and they use this as an example for a person who rises at dawn every day, which I think is okay and it has its place. But I tell you, when you look at the relationship you'll have with your clients and your athletes, you have to be able to understand how you implement both reinforcement and punishment. And they talk about behavioral conditioning equals operant conditioning. So think in terms of, when you see in the book operant, it means behavioral. And I know I've said it in other presentations, I say it in class all the time. Look, when somebody comes in and they tell you, I want to lose weight, I want to get fit, I want to bench press more weight, I want to be in shape, they are coming in with a very nebulous mindset of how they want to achieve a goal. And they're entrusting to you that you're going to walk them down that path. And for some, their experience is a very, very heavy-handed drill sergeant of a high school coach who would beat the athletes into the ground. And that's what they're expecting. That's what they think they're going to get when they come in. And they might be a little bit nervous and uptight and, frankly, a little bit scared to come see you. But they finally mustered up the courage to do so. So I think you need to be able to understand that that person overcame a pretty sizable hurdle in terms of their fear and apprehension of coming in to see a personal trainer. But I will also say this: when we look at behavior, people who come in and they sit down across the table from you, they want to make a physiological change. But for them to make a physiological change, they have to make a behavioral change, whether it's how they eat, how they allocate their time for working out, how much they sleep at night, how much water they drink. I mean, you can go on and on and on and on regarding all the behavioral components that have to happen for them to have the physiological change. But that's part of the process, and how you deliver both reinforcement and punishment to facilitate that is kind of key. I mean, it really is if you boil it down. So the book itself describes this as being shaped by consequences, meaning behaviorism, how behavior is molded, how you actually work with your clients and influence their behavior is going to be shaped by its consequences, both positive and negative consequences. And to a certain degree, you have to articulate those on the front end so your client understands that there's just not random punishment where there's no control in the process. Otherwise, it's random and there's nothing that they'll be able to do in terms of intervention or modify their behavior. Targeting behavior itself, they describe as operant or behavioral, is termed as an operant, and the probability that an operant will be repeated in the future increases the behavioral being enforced. So I'll read that word for word so it makes more sense. A target behavior, say like completing a class or a 45-minute or step aerobic class, is termed as operant, meaning behavioral. And the probability that an operant or behavior will be repeated in the future increases when the behavior is reinforced. So a person completes a 45-minute step aerobics class that you suggested they take. If you reward them somehow for that effort, they will then be reinforced to do, they've received reinforcement to then do that behavior, go to the class yet again. So it's a matter of like how you go ahead and reinforce a certain behavior or have punishment for a different behavior or punishment to reduce the behavior, if I can say it correctly. So when you look at reinforcement, the definition is this: any act, object, or event that increases the likelihood of future operant or behavioral behavior when the reinforcement follows a target behavior. And punishment is any act, object, or event that decreases the likelihood of future operant behavior when the punishment follows that behavior. So there's a timing component to this too. You know, you want to have a little bit of a window of opportunity to work with people when you're talking about punishment and reinforcement. And there's a value proposition to how soon that reinforcement or punishment is implemented to have it have greater influence. The book notes that positive and negative reinforcement are often confused, and man, do I agree with this. I mean, it's sometimes tough to wrap yourself around that and give it a big hug. But positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, they're confused because there are consequences that increase the probability of an occurrence of a desired behavior or operant. But positive reinforcement gives something, whereas negative reinforcement takes something away, right? And that's usually where the first part where people kind of get mixed up. You know, people think like negative reinforcement is yelling at that person, screaming at them, making them work harder, like it's a negative connotation. But you just have to remember one is give and one is take. And then when we look at this and you might see this somewhere else on a quiz, this comes up. A question may arise where you have a client not completing their assigned 30 minutes of cardio, so the trainer removes an enjoyable exercise from the workout. That would be considered negative reinforcement because you're taking something away from the person because they didn't complete the behavior of doing 30 minutes of cardio. Now, if they did 30 minutes of cardio and you then allow the client to do more planks because that's what they really enjoy, that becomes positive reinforcement because you're adding something back into the equation. Whereas you took the exercise out that they really like, negative reinforcement. So positive and negative reinforcement itself, it's kind of simple in that context, but then we start looking at positive and negative punishment. So it starts to kind of morph into, we go from positive and negative reinforcement, and it gets a little bit convoluted when we get into the positive and negative punishment component, where positive punishment is adding something that's adverse. Negative punishment is removal of something of value to the client. So here we are talking positive and negative, positive and negative. One is punishment, one is reinforcement. Holy smokes, it's totally confusing. So the way the book kind of, if you take it down to its nth degree, when something's removed, negative, when something is added, positive, and the behavioral itself, if you think of it in terms of increasing behavior, that'd be reinforcement. Behavioral decrease would be punishment. So if we look at this in terms of like 4 boxes, almost like a Punnett square here, you have stimulus, whether it's added or removed, and then you have behavior increases or behavior decreases. You'd have added stimulus, behavior increases, positive reinforcement. You have stimulus is removed, behavior increases, negative reinforcement. Then you have added stimulus, behavior decreases, positive punishment. And then negative punishment would be you're removing a stimuli and the behavior decreases. That's about the best way I can just take the book and frame it up. I can tell you in terms of wrapping yourself around this conceptually for the test or the quiz, there are maybe a couple questions, but they focus more about like if you take planks away from a client because they really enjoy the activity because they didn't do their 30 minutes of cardio, like we saw in a previous slide, that is where they're going to ask that's the type of question they'll ask on the actual quiz and the type of question they'll ask on the test itself. I gotta tell you, it's complicated for sure. It's complicated to wrap yourself around, but once you get it and you get the nuances between those, then it becomes a little bit easier. With self-determination theory, again, this is very heavily reviewed in our sports psychology course here. But you look at intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation, there's like a true love for the experience. I really enjoy doing something. I don't need anybody to push me. I'll just go and run anyways, or I'll go play basketball anyways. Whereas extrinsic motivation, there's a desire to engage in a behavior to get some kind of external reward, whether you're going to earn a medal, or you're going to earn a t-shirt, or whatever it is. And we talk very much about self-determination theory, and it's the implication that a person does so, they participate in activity just because of their own enjoyment and their own fulfillment, as opposed to trying to meet the expectations of others. And you look at this and you go, okay, there's a balance between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. And wonderful is when you have individuals who are very much intrinsically motivated, and you can every once in a while give them like a little extrinsic goal or extrinsic motivation, like reward, and it's just enough to kind of motivate them, and you hit a lever just right to really hit that intrinsic motivation. And there's a balance there. There really is trying to motivate your clients and help them along. So the book goes into the self-determination theory, where there's a motivation, where there's really no motivation at all. There's really a lack of intrinsic or extrinsic motivation. They're just there. Then they list the other ones: external regulation, introjected, identified, integrated, internal. The one that I think you have to focus on the most is just differentiating these and have an understanding of these, but maybe put them on a continuum and kind of map them out. But the big one is the clients exercise because they feel obligated to exercise. In other words, they feel bad or guilty if they do not exercise. They are not exercising because they inherently want to. That'd be introjected regulation. I believe you see that one somewhere else. But if you just maybe take a moment to review these, put me on pause and kind of read through these, I think that'll be enough to get an understanding about how to integrate these with a client. Rewards, both on intrinsic and both effective rewards on intrinsic motivation, if I can say it correctly. So the study demonstrated that extrinsic motivation, say like a tangible reward, or there's an expected reward or performance, competition, or engagement, it reduced the person's intrinsic motivation, whereas simply giving feedback that's positive increased intrinsic motivation. So the analysis that they did in the research, they did a meta-analysis where they went through 125 different studies. And what they found was this, that external rewards themselves reduce intrinsic motivation by shifting an individual's focus from an inherent enjoyment and interest in an activity to really focusing on the external reward system. And so it's no longer for the love of the game or enjoyment, it's because they're going to get a cookie or a t-shirt, or they're going to get some kind of medal. And so to a certain degree, external rewards undermine intrinsic motivation for the activity, which, you know, you're trying to create a reward system for your client, and you're trying to find a way to support them and motivate them, but it has to be a manner in which it becomes intrinsic to the person. The person has to have an intrinsic driver. Otherwise, they'll just stop showing up unless you give them a t-shirt every time they show up to work out. So I talk about when to intervene with motivational efforts. Knowing the when is kind of determined by where the person is in their stage of readiness on a trans-theoretical model. Again, this is a model that's used very much in sports psychology, but by identifying the stage of the readiness, you can apply the appropriate intervention. So you can take a look at like pre-contemplation. They do not intend to increase physical activity and not really thinking about doing it. There's an intervention and a motivational effort that happens, like, hey, maybe you just try joining a gym or talk to somebody who's into fitness. Maybe that's a conversation you have. That's different than somebody down here who perhaps is working out 30 minutes of moderate intensity physical activity 5 or more days a week. Now that motivation becomes different in terms of how do you keep that person going, as opposed to how do you get that person engaged in the gym life. So guys, sports psychology is actually a pretty big part of this. And when you work with different people, whether it's in business or in our business, which is physical therapy, personal training, strength conditioning, you know, you're trying to find ways. First, you're trying to find the right lever in your client or your athlete, and then you're trying to find the right way to hit those levers to motivate your client or athlete to be able to get them to have their own internal reward system, where it's not just a series of extrinsic motivation over and over and over again. And that goes back to our drivers and that 4x4, 2x2 little matrix that we had in terms of like, how do you have positive and negative, both reinforcement and punishment, to be able to elicit the response that you want. No doubt about it, we all have our own personas and personalities, but it's how we implement and work with other people who have their own personalities that matters. All right, guys, have a good one.